we see Ivan Illich exhibiting all those things. And what I added to this, which I think is part of the genius of Tolstoy, is that he doesn't only see it as a personal response of an individual, although that's how we are having it presented to us here in this work, that somebody is denying, is angry, is bargaining, is depressed, and finally accepts death. He exhibits that personally. Now remember, he's a judge as well. And he's presenting his account as a representation of the authorities and the way in which his society views these things. And that's the added piece that I think the psychologists miss on this, is there's a social manifestation of all of these things that we describe here, or at least Kubler-Ross does, in terms of the relation to suffering, or more specifically death, is to try and do all these things. And that is exactly what Tolstoy demonstrates in this little novella, which, as I said, was written after his conversion experience, if you will, in the age of 50. An awareness that his own society was trying to deny the reality of death. And they lived their lives in a manner which would insulate themselves from that reality. And they did it in various ways, but primarily by trying to climb the corporate ladder. And that's what characterizes Ivan Illich himself. And so I said last time, the structure of the work is really interesting in that light. It reflects, it's making a social commentary, it's making a personal spiritual commentary, but it's also, through the structure of the work, representing something of the experience of coming to die. And the way he does this is, the novella is written in 12 chapters, I said. And the first 4 are the longest and deal with the first 40-odd years of Ivan's life. The second 4 happen after he falls from a ladder. It's almost, I mean, it is symbolic. He falls from the ladder. He's been climbing the ladder. He falls from the ladder, injures his side, and at first he doesn't think it's serious, but it ends up being quite serious. And so those 4 chapters deal with his suffering, and again, the ages of anger and denial, and bargaining to some degree. And he brings in the medical establishment to try and help him out. And doctors then examine him and try and come up with some sort of analysis of what ails him and how he can undo the damage. But because at this point he's not willing to even face the possibility that he could be dying. And remember, we said in chapter 1, all of his friends exhibited exactly that same thing. So what we see is Ivan is a representation of the people that met him or surrounded his coffin right at the beginning of the novella. They're all the same in this respect. But those 4 chapters, chapters 5 to 8, are briefer, and they express something about Ivan's limitations now. So the first 4, he's a young man, he's traveling a lot. He's very mobile, he's very active, he's very enterprising, and he's very ambitious. So he goes from school to university to the courts of law and moves from here to there to advance his career, and marries a woman, not because he loves her, but for the same reason. He thinks that she is a good partner to help him with this because of her position. And we saw that she had the same views towards him at his death. She was looking for ways that his death would somehow benefit her. So that we get a portrait of a societal ill here. And so those middle 4 chapters, as I say, deal with the shrinking then of his ability to move. Because he's injured, you can't move around. The final 4 chapters are the briefest of the 4, and they deal with him not only stuck, confined to his house, he's confined to his bed. He can't get off his couch, in fact. And so what we get is in the structuring of the narrative, something of the experience of suffering and pain, and what it will mean in terms of your intent to climb the ladder being addressed and being frustrated by pain and suffering. And so it's an extraordinary account just on that front. And as I say, it took him 2 years to write this. Tolstoy, known for War and Peace and Anna Karenina, these enormous novels. This little novella is I think, in some ways, I don't want to say it's superior, but it is a perfect little novella. Why would I have this last time? I'll just put it up here if I can see. There we go. I got the text in front of me, but this will work. Yes. I think I'll shrink it down just a little bit. But those who are visitors will see. So there we go. So as I say, in chapter 2, it says the past history of Ivan Ilyich's life was most simple and ordinary and most terrible. He died at the age of 45, a member of the court of law. So he is the son of an official, made his career in St. Petersburg in various ministries and departments of the sort that brings people to a position in which, though it becomes clear that they are unfit to perform any sort of substantial duties, still, because of their long past service and rank, they cannot be dismissed. And therefore they receive invented, fictitious posts and non-fictitious thousands, from 6 to 10, on which they live to a ripe old age. So it's about becoming a part of the bureaucracy. And so Ivan manages, by dint of his associations and by dint of his ambition, to get a means of living for himself, and becomes effectively insulated from the concerns of death, which are to some degree broader than simply dying. It's more connected to a sense of not being in control of your life. I said that last time, that there's something here in the story of Ivan Ilych that, although it's written in the 19th century and is dealing with feudal Russia, really, is very much a contemporary commentary. Because as I said to you last time, in the Western world, shall we say, and I don't know about the rest of the world, I can't comment on it, but there is an attempt to insulate ourselves from the possibility of death. And so we don't tend to see it. Most of us have not seen somebody die in front of us because, in general, it's a gradual process. It doesn't happen immediately. If it does, then the death happens, and again, you might see a car accident or something. But in general, people get sick, and are put in institutions to deal with that. And the professionals then deal with the reality of death. And we are isolated from that and insulated from it, so we don't have to think about it. And part of this is for their good, and part of it, and this might be Tolstoy's commentary, is to express the social fear of the reality of living and the limitations of human existence and the reality of human mortality. It's the ultimate statistic. Every human that comes to live also dies. And the insurance companies have something called a countdown calculator that, if you were so, I would say, reckless as to type in your data on this, would tell you when you were going to die, based on family background, lifestyle, where you live, your sex, your activities, and if you put enough data in there, they'll give you a day, and the insurance companies will use this as a basis of how they're going to insure you and at what cost, because they know the statistics demonstrate certain things. But all of that insurance is a way of insuring you against an early death, but not against death, because that against death you cannot be insured. That would be quite the thing. I might buy in for that one, if you could. But he dies at the age of 45, and he is part of the bureaucracy, but he's not particularly competent. And Tolstoy here is commenting on a general tendency of the modern state, that it requires people who are competent but not too competent, and who are part of the system then. And he is a privy councillor, as Tolstoy says, the unnecessary member of various unnecessary institutions. And that was his father, and he had 3 sons, and Ivan was one of them. And as I say, he goes and he is called the phoenix of the family. The phoenix, if you recall the mythological bird, you probably know it from Harry Potter, is this mythological being that comes into life once every, I can't remember, 500 years or something, lives for a while. There's only one, there aren't pairs. Lives and dies, goes back to the ashes, and then arises from the ashes after 500 years. So he's described as the phoenix of the family, and that, again, is a symbol of something about Ivan. There's something unique about him, and which seems to be rather bright, and he's not as cold and meticulous as the elder, and not as desperate as the younger. He was between the two, an intelligent, lively, pleasant, and decent man. So I think we need to note this here as well. Tolstoy is not suggesting that Ivan is bad in any way. And that's part of the power of the story, is because he makes him just like the medieval morality play. He makes him every man. And that's part of what makes us connect to this particular individual. If he were a bad man, we don't identify with him. If he were too good, again, we would not exactly identify with him. We would see it as a tragedy. But we wouldn't see it as something that directly implicates our humanity. And Tolstoy, the spiritual writer that he is, wants us to be able to immediately identify with him in ways that will not see any sort of personal differentiation at all. So he makes him just like his readership. So in law school, he's already what he would be throughout his later life, a capable man, cheerfully good-natured and gregarious, but strict in fulfilling what he considered his duty. And he considered his duty all that was so considered by highly placed people. This is interesting. He doesn't appeal to any sense of moral law. He doesn't appeal to a sense of being in relationship with God. There's no higher law. There's not anything like what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao. What he regards as his duty is pleasing those in authority over him. And the assumption is that maybe they perhaps have better motivations than he. But he does it simply on the basis of rank. And again, that's also symbolized in the ladder that he falls down from. The steps on the ladder, the rungs on the ladder that he's been climbing, to some degree he is assuming that the aristocracy of Russia, this is, remember, pre-Soviet Russia, has an integrity about it, and he can just climb that ladder, and as long as he pleases his superiors, no ill shall befall him. And so, again, as I say, I think it's subtle, but I do think Tolstoy is questioning how aristocratic the aristocrats are. And remember, or maybe it's not a remember because I didn't say, he's Count Leo Tolstoy. He is an aristocrat by birth. And he wants then us to consider something outside of mere position. He wants to consider merit, but also the intrinsic qualities that come with being a human being, and chiefly that of the reality of death. But he's a good man. All the passions of childhood and youth went by without leaving big traces on him. He had been given to sensuality and vanity, and towards the end, in the upper classes, to liberalism. But it was all within certain limits, which were correctly pointed out to him by his instinct. So again, he learns to be a rule follower, but more than a rule follower, a obeyer of rank. And what he's going to depict here is, and let me put this, no, I won't, I will put it on the board here. It seems to me important if I have a whiteboard marker, and if I don't, I'll just say it. I'm not sure if I do. I don't. So I'll say it. What is at issue here? Well, maybe I do. Yes, I do. Okay, splendid. So it will be easier if I put this. From a Christian point of view. And this is Martin Luther's observation, the one I'm going to make here. There are two ways of seeing the spiritual life. And Luther contrasts them. There's one that he calls the Theologia Gloriae. And then there's the one that he contrasts to it, which he calls the Theologia Crucis, the theology of the cross. And what this means, the theology of the cross, is it's not just a different sort of theology, it's an antithetical theology to the way in which the world sees things. And he sees it in particular at the cross. Now remember, Tolstoy's Death of Ivan Ilyich is about suffering and about death. And so one of the ironies of this, I noted last time when we talked about chapter 1, is that the mourners, when they came into the funeral chapel, were crossing themselves repeatedly, not because they thought about the cross at all, but simply because it was a social custom. And he reflexively did it, and he bowed at the same time, and he was faintly ludicrous, etc. And Tolstoy intentionally is satirizing the habits of Christianity without any content to it. But at the cross, Luther is going to say something very important that I think we need to consider in relation to this novella as well. And that is, at the cross, the world perceives a certain thing. So world perceives, what do they see? They perceive shame. There's a man, a Jewish man, who's been crucified in public, and he has no clothes on. What could be more shameful? What else do they perceive? Weakness. His enemies taunt to him, why don't you, you said that you could raise others from the dead. Why don't you come down? They perceive weakness. They're laughing at him. Put a crown of thorns on him. They're bowing down to him. They see a fool. They see folly in front of them. What else do they see? Well, they see condemnation of a criminal. Is this not so? Is this not evident? I mean, obvious, just from the gospel stories. They see a man who's been condemned. And clearly, that's what the cross is. It's the state approved execution mechanism. He's been condemned to death. They also see these two things, sin and death. Death, obvious, the outcome. But sin, this is a bad man. The Romans didn't crucify everyone. They crucified people that were guilty of capital offenses, particularly bad men. So there's a moral aspect to this. That's what the world sees in this. But the Theologia Crucis sees something very different. So the world sees this and perceives this. Now this is the way that life has been lived by Ivan Ilyich. To see in death the repudiation of everything good is the way the world perceives suffering and death. But Luther says at the cross there's something very different here. And I'm thinking I should pull this back because it's now in the bright light there, and it probably causes you problems to see it. Rather than shame, there's glory. This is a theological. This is what the scriptures tell us. There's a glory in the suffering of the cross. Rather than weakness, there's strength. Now, in what sense is there strength? Well, in the death of our Lord, Jesus breaks the power of sin by bearing our sins, and by dying takes the death that we deserve, but then by rising overcomes both sin and death. There's strength. Strength through weakness, right? Rather than folly, Paul speaks of this as the wisdom of God. Foolishness to the world, but the wisdom of God. Rather than condemnation, acquittal. By his stripes we are healed. Acquittal not of him, but of us. We are acquitted. By faith in him, we are not guilty before the judgment seat of God. Finally, rather than sin, righteousness. So that, again, the gospel writers and the hymn writers will say that we're clothed in his righteousness. And finally, rather than death, life. Sorry if you can't see that at the back. I'll push this over here. Maybe that helps a little bit. Sorry for my crummy writing. But this is what I think Tolstoy is getting at in this story. And now he doesn't get at it sufficiently Christian, in a sufficiently Christian manner to my mind, but he does sense that the importance of the meaning of death, and that there is a greater meaning to that. And he expresses it in particular in the way that he first tries to deny the reality of death, then to avoid it, deny it, get angry at it, bargain with it, and ultimately accept it. The acceptance comes in this image of the black sack, which, recall, at first he doesn't want to go into it. He's on his sick bed, which is actually just the sofa, and he has this dream of being pushed into a black sack. And the reader then wonders, well, what exactly is this black sack? It's not made clear. It's clearly a symbol. But I think the most obvious thing is it's death. It represents death, and he doesn't want to die. But the issue for him is that he's in great pain, and he wants to alleviate the pain. When you're in pain, you can't think of anything else. I don't know if anyone's been in serious pain here before. Most of us, at least I'll speak for myself, have had it in the form of a toothache, or maybe a broken limb or something, but for me, a terrible toothache. You can't think about anything else. And all sense of time passes, and actually the pain seems limitless. So even though he's stuck in his room or in his living room on his bed, and he's only there for 3 weeks, it probably seems like an eternity. And he can't move. And the suffering that he undergoes is so acute that he wants to be alleviated from it. So death is not something that he will now seek to avoid at all costs, but something that he'd be willing to embrace. And that comes in the second installment of the dream, in which he sees a light at the bottom, and he wants to go into the light. And for those who are acquainted with the scriptures, as Tolstoy probably was, light, the sense of light, comes with the life of Christ. Jesus is the light of the world. When in John's Gospel, John 14, when Jesus at the Last Supper gives Judas the morsel, just like he fed all of them, he says, "Go out and do what you came to do." The last line of that chapter is that he went out and it was night. John's Gospel, it says it was night. And the night then is going to express the sense of the eclipse of the light. It's coming. And Jesus is bringing it about. He's initiating. It's not just that Judas is betraying him, but that Jesus says, now's the time. Go and do what you came to do. And so the sin that he has spoken against and the life that he has commanded in himself, and you can only have life in me, he's now going to give that up for a time. By the way, I've always said, questions anytime, feel free to interrupt me. I don't regard it as in any way rude, as long as you raise your hand and do it respectfully, but I'm not worried about that here. If you have any questions or comments, by all means, do so. But this is what's at stake here. Not that Tolstoy talks about this, but I think it's implicit in the passage. And this is the real issue, because again, the world perceives the shame, but what does the world perceive in the cross? All the things that it perceives on its own merits, it gets glory, strength, wisdom, a sense of acquittal, that is, and we're morally good. We're righteous, and we have life. That's what they think, that living the corporate life, climbing the ladder, the career ladder, that's what they think they have. And death and the cross are the repudiation of all those things. But it's exactly the other way around. And the reason that Tolstoy endorses this is because in the end, he shows that this man, Ivan, at the end of it all, sees the light and goes into it and embraces it. And with that comes a whole-scale repudiation of the life of the Russian aristocracy, allegedly Christian, but only superficially so. It's a tale for its age, but I think it's a tale for every age. So let me move this out of your way so that you can see this here. Hope you managed to get that down. Note that he's capable of separating his duties from his private life and of inspiring general respect. This becomes very important increasingly important in the 19th and the 20th century. We're going to see in our next novella, Heart of Darkness, that we have other such people that live like this. They separate meaning from their duties. They separate morality from their duties. They have to do their duty. And the greatest, and for me the most striking thing I ever read about this was as an undergraduate studying Nazi Germany and European history. I did English and history for my undergrad. And a man by the name of Adolf Eichmann, who who's heard of Adolf Eichmann? Any of you? At the back, I suspected he might. For the rest of you, I'll give a little more detail here. Adolf Eichmann was a bureaucrat, and he was a very good one, very capable, so capable that he was eventually put into the position of managing the deportation of the Jews to the east, and sort of being the manager of that whole thing, which takes a great deal of skill. Administrative skill is an extraordinary ability. I wish I had more of it. And he had it in spades. And as we know, the outcome of the Second World War, what was discovered, 6 million Jews had been sent to the east and perished in the gas chambers and so forth. 6 million. And Eichmann was one of those that were being hunted down for having perpetrated these crimes against humanity. And the state of Israel, in fact, had agents that went around the world trying to find these people that went, either if they didn't die, they went incognito and they're hiding out somewhere. They captured him in Argentina and brought him back to Jerusalem. Put him on trial in 1961. So 16 years he's been, some think that he was in Canada for a bit. Anyway, they caught him in Argentina, brought him back to Jerusalem, and put him on trial. And he was behind bulletproof glass, because I think you can still see footage on YouTube from the period. But it was a trial for crimes against humanity, and Eichmann in the booth revealed various things about himself. One of them was that he actually had no animosity towards the Jew whatsoever. That was his claim. His interrogators did not believe him, could not believe him, because you killed 6 million. You were the architect of the whole system for doing this. How could you do this? He said not only did he not have any animosity towards them, particular, he was a believer in the Jewish state. So, there's a writer by the name of Theodor Herzl who wrote something called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and proposed, because of the historic mistreatment of the Jews, that the Jews get their own state so that they could have a people for themselves and stop being persecuted, etc. And he said, I was a committed Zionist. And I think, okay. So not only you say that you weren't against them, but in a sense, you were on their side. And when he started out in this administrative position, he thought that he would be fulfilling his dream, because the plan was to take the Jews from Europe and send them somewhere else. And somewhere else, there were various plans, but one of the places was Madagascar, which, if you remember playing Risk, I don't know if anyone plays Risk, is off the southeast coast of Africa, but an island down there, sort of a strange venue. But that was the plan. And it was thwarted when the Allies came up through Italy in 1943. That route was no longer possible. So the plans shifted, and they shifted from the plan of exporting to eliminating. And he was asked the question, if you bear no animosity towards the Jews and you're a committed Zionist, then how could you do such a thing? And he said, well, I was given orders. It was a Hitlerbefehl. It was an order from the Führer. It was the law of the land. And he added one further thing. He said he looked around to all the aristocrats and nobody was making a peep of dissent. And he said, if I, a little man, because he didn't see himself as this grand figure, if I'm just a functionary, a bureaucrat, I look to those in authority and nobody's protesting, then who am I? They must know better. Now, this is why I'm talking about Ivan here. He's a functionary. He's not a bad man. And he doesn't commit Eichmann's atrocities, obviously. But he's effectively neutral in some ways. And he seems to have distanced himself from any sense of the meaning of life by avoiding it, by climbing and never getting the sense that falling is even possible, such that, again, his friends don't even talk about death, except as a means of advantaging themselves. So again, it's like the medieval morality play, Everyman, but with a particularly modern twist on it, which is now that there are ways to improve your lot in life that will insulate you wholly from sickness and death. And even a medical bureaucracy that's there for the same reason. To try and manage death, to keep us away from it. But chiefly, to keep us from the fear of death. Because I think that's a main driver here, is the fear of death. Can anyone think of passages in Scripture where it talks about the fear of death that would be pertinent here? Anyone think of any off the top of their heads? Sure.
Remember the exact passage, but wasn't it like the night before Jesus was supposed to be crucified, he was crying to the Father, why are you doing this to me? Or something like that?
So, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asks, he's already eaten the Last Supper, and he knows what's coming, and he said, make it so. But even then, in the Garden of Gethsemane, which, by the way, is just opposite the Kidron Valley, you can look out and you can see Jerusalem right in front of you. He sweats blood and asks for the cup to be taken from him. He doesn't want this, if it's at all possible. It says, but then says, but not my will, but yours be done. Right? So that the instance. But he's not addressing fear there, but it's his fear. This is very interesting. It's very interesting. This is, remember, we talk about, when we speak of Jesus, one of the complexities for us is the Christian doctrine that he is both God and man. Here we hear the man speaking very clearly about his fear of what's coming. And it's not just his death, but there's something more than that for him. And it's hard to know what exactly that means, but it means being cut off from God, and he is God. So maybe that's a part of it, how terrible it is. Yes?
And then Psalm 23, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,
I will fear no evil. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. In the presence of my enemies, even. I think it's a direct reference to Jesus, as well as being a generally applicable text. For sure. Jesus repeatedly, when he goes out, tells people not to be afraid. What does he understand about the human heart? That we're motivated by fear, driven by it. It becomes the decision maker for most people. And in fact, I won't say most people, all people are driven by fear, unless they have the theology of the cross. And even then, they need to remind themselves, because fear is it's not just for small children that people are motivated by fear. Yes. But be of good heart. I have overcome the world. Right? And so trust in me. Have faith. Do not be afraid. It's stated not. It's not only the repetition that makes it a strong reminder. It's the awareness of Jesus, of what we would call the psyche of his audience. He knows what it's like to be a human being. He knows what it's like to be mortal. He knows what it's like to be afraid of death, and he himself is. And then at the cross itself, in pitch darkness at the hour of noon, right when the sun is at its height, the sky goes dark for 3 hours. It's not an eclipse. No eclipse lasts 3 hours. Right at noon, it goes dark for pitch black for 3 hours. And when he dies, he cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? So the dereliction of the cross. This is God saying to God that he's forsaken by God. And he's forsaken by God so that we may never be forsaken by God. That's the theology of the cross. Nobody is God forsaken, except God. God was forsaken by God. What that means, we don't even know, except by analogy. Most of us get our meaning from relationships, good relationships with ones we love, with our family, with our friends, with our whoever. Many ways of the relationship of love being expressed with our favorite pets. That cut off entirely, an unbroken, perfect relationship being severed. That's what it means. If you can apply it by analogy, by all means do so, but I think the analogies basically fail. It's too hard to express how powerful this exactly is. There is another, any comments or questions there? Yes?
But according to the reading, it said his brother followed his father's steps. But I think he didn't. He didn't follow his father's steps.
You're talking about Ivan?
Yeah.
In what sense?
I read only chapter up to 11.
Okay, so you didn't get to the end.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think that will, well then finish. I don't want to take it away, but then again, I guess I'm going to have to avoid the spoiler alert. But no, so he didn't follow his father's footsteps. I'm not quite sure where it says that in the text. I don't think that there's anything wrong with Ivan per se. That isn't wrong with the social view of death and the attempt to avoid death, which he shares in common with everyone else, including his father. And it would lose some of its potency as a tale if it weren't universal. That's what I said earlier. He's not worse than us. He's not better than us. He's basically the same as us. So Tolstoy's not going after a particular group that he doesn't like. He's going after the social mindset of this world. Yes?
How widely was Tolstoy's works taken in at this time? Like, how many people would this have gone out to?
He was very popular. Yeah. He's Leo Tolstoy is often accounted the greatest novelist. Obviously, there's a great deal of debate that can be had about that, but this work was widely and approved. It probably marked him as a writer. I mean, it's so good. To this day, it is used in legal communities and the medical community as ways of approaching death and dying. Remember, I talked about that at the outset, the 5 stages of grief. Well, he expresses all of them. So it's a great way in a story of expressing, and it does so in a way which is not specifically religious, but of how we die well and not just avoid it. That's being manifested here. And it says even something about palliative care. This text would be a model text for addressing the subject, because if you're in grief counseling or pastoral counseling of any sort, walking people through the process, it helps to have a story that they can identify with. And this is a story that does. As I say, I think it loses a bit of potency by not being more Christian. Because he could have talked about the theology of the cross, and he doesn't do that. He just talks about the suffering of the individual, which has no merit in and of itself. But at least it's moving in the right direction, shall we say. Okay, so back to this story. But it was exceptionally popular. But note this at the beginning of chapter 7, how it came about in the third month of Ivan Ilyich's illness, it was impossible to say because it came about step by step, imperceptibly. But what came about was that his wife and daughter and son and the servants and acquaintances and the doctors and above all, he himself, knew that for others the whole interest in him consisted only in how soon he would finally vacate his place. Free the living from the constraint caused by his presence, and be freed himself from his sufferings. What stage of grief would he be at? Something along the lines of acceptance. But it adds a little bit of a twist to it, and this is the bit that's so alarming. It's not that only that he wants to be freed from the pain and knows that he's going to die. It's that everyone around him wants him to go. That's a hard one. It's actually a hard one for people who have lost a loved one to admit to themselves, is that they are selfish in dealing with other people's suffering. They want to be rid of it. I mean, his wife at the beginning, it was so bad. When she was talking about Ivan's grief, only talked about her own. It was so terrible in his last days. He cried out. He screamed for 3 days straight. And she said, I could hear him through 3 closed doors. So, away, got as far away as she could, and yet could still hear him screaming. And she was upset that she couldn't insulate herself from that. But no sense of commiserating with him even. Distancing her. So she represents Ivan. And Ivan represents all of us. There's one exception, and that's this fellow, Gerasim. In this most unpleasant matter, there also appeared a consolation for Ivan Ilych. The butler's helper, Gerasim, always came to clear away after him. He was a clean, fresh, young muzhik, grown sleek on town grub. Always cheerful, bright. At first, the sight of this man, always clean, dressed in Russian style, performing his repulsive chore, embarrassed Ivan Ilych. Gerasim. Does the name Gerasim remind you of anything? I'm not sure it will, but Gerasim, does it sound familiar at all? Think of the gospel accounts. There's a man who's demon possessed, crazy, the Gerasim demoniac. It's Gerasim. This is Gerasim. I'm not sure of the etymology or whether there's any linkage, but this is a man who, from the vantage point of the world, is doing a crazy thing. He's devoting himself to the alleviation of the suffering of a fellow human being. And he will play a very important role in his life. And he's dressed like a muzhik, he's like a peasant. So the aristocrats have all abandoned him. But this man, who is the butler's helper, he's not even the butler, he's his helper, is willing to help him. So Gerasim in heavy boots, spreading around him the pleasant smell of boot tar and the freshness of winter air, came in with a light, strong step, in a clean canvas apron and a clean cotton shirt, the sleeves rolled up. And his bared, strong young arms, and without looking at Ivan Ilych, obviously restraining the joy of life shining on his face, so as not to offend the sick man, went to the commode. This is a man who has the light of Christ in him. He has a joy not in the suffering of others, but in fact he's trying to shield Ivan from that because he doesn't want to upset him. But he lives for a purpose. He walks in the light. He knows the theology of the cross, I would submit to you. And he's the one hero in the story that stands out from the rest. So he is there to serve others. to love and serve others, particularly those who are ill and infirm. And with a quick movement, he turned to the sick man, his fresh, kind, simple young face only just beginning to sprout a beard. "What, sir? I suppose this must be unpleasant for you. Excuse me, I can't help it." "Mercy, sir." And Gerasim flashed his eyes and bared his young white teeth. "Why shouldn't I do it? It's a matter of you being sick." With his deft, strong hands, he did his usual business and went out, stepping lightly. And 5 minutes later, stepping just as lightly, he came back. Ivan Ilyich was still sitting the same way in the armchair. "Gerasim," he said, when the man had set down the clean-washed commode, "help me, please. Come here." Gerasim went to him. "Lift me up. It's hard for me alone, and I've sent Dmitri away." And he goes with him, and he lifts him up and puts him down on the sofa. And what you see is that he treats him with compassion. He treats him like a child. And even more than that, and this is important, to alleviate his pain, what does he do? "Hold my legs a little higher, can you? Lift the legs higher." And it seemed to Ivan that in that position he felt no pain at all. It made him feel better that while Gerasim held his legs. Now, if you think about the ladder and the symbolism of the ladder and going up in his own power, now somebody's holding his legs. And what the image that Tolstoy will use here is he is like a nurse giving succor to a woman who's about to give birth. The stirrups, the legs go up. It alleviates his pain and his suffering. The main torment we read for Ivan Ilyich was the lie that for some reason acknowledged by everyone that he was merely ill and not dying, and that he needed only to keep calm and be treated, and then something very good would come of it. And he was tormented by that lie, tormented that no one wanted to acknowledge what they all knew, and he knew, but wanted to lie to him about his terrible situation and wanted him and even forced him to participate in that lie. It's all going to be all right. You're going to be right as rain before long. And he knows it's a lie, and they know it's a lie, and they insist that he go along with the lie, and this is the thing he finds unbearable. What will people not do to avoid death? In my days, we've gone from funerals to celebrations of life at funerals, called celebrations of life. I think there's something telling in it, insofar as it's avoiding the terrible sense of loss. The lie, this lie perpetrated upon him on the eve of his death, the lie that must needs reduce the dreadful solemn act of his death to the level of all their visits, curtains, sturgeon dinners, caviar, was terribly tormenting for Ivan Ilyich. And strangely, many times, as they were performing the tricks over him, he was a hair's breadth from shouting at them, "Stop lying. You know and I know that I'm dying, so at least stop lying." But he never had the courage to do it. Only Gerasim understood that situation and pitied him. And therefore, Ivan Ilyich felt good only with Gerasim. He's a truthful man. He sees the reality of the situation in front of him, and he doesn't run away from it. In fact, he's going to be right there alongside those who are being abandoned by those who live the theology of glory and don't understand the theology of the cross. It felt good to him when Gerasim held his legs up, sometimes all night long, and refused to go to sleep. Remember, for a time, Jesus, even on the Via Dolorosa, he fell down and somebody carried the cross for a bit. It's like Gerasim, picking up his legs. "Don't worry, Ivan Ilyich, I'll still get some sleep." Or when suddenly addressing him familiar, he said, "Maybe if you weren't sick, but why not be a help?" Gerasim alone did not lie. Everything showed that he alone understood what it was all about and did not find it necessary to conceal it, and simply pitied his emaciated, weakened master. Once he even said straight out, as Ivan Ilyich was sending him away, "We'll all die. Why not take the trouble?" Expressing by that he was not burdened by his trouble precisely because he was bearing it for a dying man, and hoped that when his time came, someone would go to the same trouble about him. This is what it means to follow Jesus. It's not only to be the beneficiaries of the death that he laid down for us all that we can't repeat, but also to bear our own crosses and follow his example. And the most tormenting thing, aside from the lie, was that no one pitied him as he wanted to be pitied. And what is that? He wanted to be pitied by someone like a sick child. He didn't want to be treated with dignity, as if he were his former self. He wanted to be treated as a man who was so weak he couldn't get off the couch, like a baby. It's humiliating for an adult to be treated like a child. Watch it if you, well, one day you will see it, but your grandparents, they've lost the strength of their youth, and they're probably, in most cases, not very happy about it at all. And so there's a way of avoiding that, which is just to act as if everything was the same as before. But it's a lie. And part of that's the denial of the suffering. And the suffering in that sense is not even physical suffering, it's the sense of the vanity of the theology of glory. Ivan Illich wanted to weep, wanted to be caressed and wept over, and then comes his colleague, the judge Shebek, and instead of weeping and caressing, Ivan Illich makes a serious, stern, profoundly thoughtful face, and by inertia gives his opinion on the significance of a decision of the appeals court and stubbornly insists on it. This lie around and within him poisoned most of all the last days of Ivan Illich's life. So he is still in denial. Acceptance, denial. If you read those 5 stages of grief, they aren't actually stages. They're distinct aspects of it, but they can go back and forth. He still hasn't accepted that he's going to die. He knows it and doesn't. Knows it and doesn't. He's allowed by his Shebek to come in and act as if he were still capable, and he's happy to participate in the deceit, which Tolstoy calls poison. 8 to 12. This is the denouement of the plot. As I say, he doesn't even get off his sick bed at this point. Would you like to lie on the sofa? He needs to tidy up the room, and I'm in his way. I am uncleanness, disorder, Ivan thought, and said only, no, let me be. But note the contempt he has for himself. He has contempt for his bodily illness. He hates himself. I've been around elderly family, and that's exactly how they feel. They're ashamed. So will you and I be, I think. It's not a moral judgment. There's a sense of dignity that's been lost when you're in this way. And note the way he puts it, I am uncleanness, disorder. What can I do for you, sir? My watch. Picked up the watch, 8:30. Are they up yet? No, sir. His son, Vasily Ivanovich, has gone to school, and Praskovia Fyodorovna, his wife, gave orders to wake her if you asked for her. Shall I do so? No, don't. Shouldn't I try some tea? He thought. Yes, bring tea. Peter went to the door. Ivan Illich was afraid to be left alone. How can I keep him? Ah, yes, my medicine. Peter, give me my medicine. Who knows, maybe the medicine will still help. Took a spoonful and swallowed it. No, it won't help. It's all nonsense, deception. No, I can't believe it anymore. But the pain, why the pain? If only it would stop for a moment. And he moaned. Peter turned back. No, go, bring the tea. So you get this, again, the internal monologue. And again, Ivan exhibiting the very things that he hates about the people around him, namely that he denies what's happening to him. And he does it himself. And so there's this negotiation going on within him that, again, is talked about as a stage of grief. There's a bargaining back and forth until he finally gets to the point where the black sack vision comes. Gerasim holds up his legs again, and let's come to the passage in which he has the dreams. I believe it's in 9. Correct me if I'm wrong. But note the internal monologue that goes on within him. It not only are the chapters short, his thoughts are short. There aren't lengthy disquisitions on the meaning of life or so forth. It's little brief thoughts, which is, again, appropriate to the situation. It's dramatically plausible. You don't think long thoughts when you're in pain. They're short, and they're to the point. What do you want was the first idea. What do you want? What do you want, he repeated to himself. What? Not to suffer, to live, he replied. And again he gave himself entirely to such intense attention that even the pain did not distract him. To live? To live how? Said the voice of his soul. Now, for the first time, his soul comes up. There's a distinction there too. His soul comes into the discussion. He didn't have a soul before, or it was as if he didn't have a soul. He'd been acting as if he didn't have a soul. That was the part of him that was denying the reality of death. But now that he faces death, there are two voices within him. To live how? Yes, to live as I have lived before, nicely, pleasantly. As you lived before, nicely and pleasantly, asked the voice. And he started to go over in his imagination the best moments of his pleasant life. But strange thing, all those best moments of his pleasant life seem now not at all as they had seemed then. All, except for his first memories of childhood. There in childhood, there had been something really pleasant, which one could live with if it came back. But the man who had experienced that pleasure was no more. It was as if the memory was about someone else. Remember Wordsworth's, when he talked about childhood, talked about being in the age of thoughtless youth, when he experienced the world in an unmediated fashion, took delight in things but didn't really think about them much. If you have young children, you know exactly what this is like. But as you grow older, you become more self-aware. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know whatever stage it is, but comes a stage where people become more self-aware. I think it's 8 or 9. And they're aware of how others perceive them at that point. And with that, the realm that Wordsworth calls experience or civilization comes. And with that, a contradiction of his life, at least from the vantage point of the deathbed here. Further from childhood, the closer to the present, the more worthless and dubious were those joys. So his soul is causing him to reassess the meaning and purpose of his life as he lived it, the choices that he made. There had still been some truly good things there. There had been merriment, there had been friendship, there had been hopes, but in the higher grades, those good moments had already become more rare. Then, during the initial time of working for the governor, there had been good moments. There were his memories of love for a woman. Then it all became confused and there were still less that was good. And further on, still less of the good. And the further, the less. His marriage, so accidental, and the disenchantment, and the smell of his wife's breath, and the sensuality, the dissembling, and this deadly service, and these worries about money, and that for a year and 2 and 10 and 20 and all of it the same. And the further, the deadlier, as if I were going steadily downhill while imagining I was going up. Remember the ladder. As if this. So it's a total reassessment. And so it was. In public opinion, I was going uphill. And exactly to that extent, life was slipping away from me, from under me. And now, that's it. So die. And what is this? Why, it can't be. Can it be that life is so meaningless and vile? This is what the Ecclesiastes says, that life is vanity. It's all vanity. Whether you're a king or a beggar, he's experienced all these things under the sun. There's nothing new. It's all vanity. And indeed, it is indeed so vile and meaningless. Then why die? And die suffering. Something's not right. Note how brief the chapter is. Maybe I did not live as I should have, would suddenly come up into his head. But how not? If I did everything one ought to, he would say to himself, and at once drive this sole solution of the whole riddle of life and death away from him as something completely impossible. What do you want now, then? To live? To live how? To live as you live in court? When the usher proclaims, court is in session, court is in session, court is in session, he repeated to himself, here is that court. But I'm not guilty, he cried out angrily. What for? And he stopped weeping and turned his face to the wall, began to think about one and the same thing. Why? What for all this horror? Another 2 weeks go by. And then he does get the dream. I thought it was 9, but it is 10. Two states of his mind alternated from the very beginning of the illness. The further the illness went, the more dubious and fantastic came the considerations of the kidney, and the more real the awareness of approaching death. He needed only to recall what he had seen, he had been 3 months ago, and what he was now. To recall how steadily he'd gone downhill from any possible hope to be destroyed. And in that recent time of solitude in which he found himself lying face to the back of the sofa. No, he's not even facing the room now. He's looking at something right up against his face. That's his life and reality. He sees nothing. Remember, Milton was blind when he wrote Paradise Lost. He's lost his ability to see with the eyes of flesh. A solitude than which there could be none more total anywhere. Not at the bottom of the sea, not under the earth. In the recent time of that dreadful solitude, Ivan Illich had lived only on imaginings of the past. One after another, pictures of the past began to appear to him. It's too painful. And right there, along with this course of recollection, another course was going on in his soul. Again, the awakening soul. It's not that he didn't have one before, but it was submerged. It was beneath. He wouldn't allow the soul to speak out in him. He suppressed it. Part of him that would be able to contemplate death and think about that had never been allowed to even rise into the conversation. How his illness had grown and worsened. The further back it went, the more life there was. Okay. Not more death, but more life. There was more goodness in life and more of life itself. The two merged together. As my torment kept getting worse and worse, so the whole of life got worse and worse, he thought. There was one bright spot back there at the beginning of life, and then it became ever darker and darker, ever quicker and quicker. That's what the Romantics say life is like. You're walking away from the light. You're going further and further into the darkness of the world. You're becoming more and more civilized, but you lose the whole meaning and purpose of life in the process. And this image of a stone plunging down with increasing speed sank into his soul. Life, a series of ever increasing suffering, races faster and faster towards its end. The most dreadful suffering. I'm racing. He would give a start, rouse himself, want to resist, but he already knew that it was impossible to resist. With eyes weary from looking, but unable not to look at. Apologies. What was before him. He gazed at the back of the sofa and waited. He can't even turn himself. Waited for that dreadful fall, impact, destruction. It's impossible to resist. But at least to understand what for. What for? Torment, death, what for? So 2 weeks went by. His wife comes in. She wants to talk to him. He wants nothing to do with her. Even says, for Christ's sake, let me die in peace. She is no solace to him. She lives in the way that he had lived his life before. Now he knows that he cannot live in that life. It's not because there's something great and good about Ivan Illich. It's just that he can't deny reality any longer. She was going to leave, but just then their daughter came in and went over to greet them. He looked at his daughter in the same way as his wife, and to her questions about his health, said dryly to her that he would soon free them of all of himself. They fell silent, sat for a while, and left. What fault is it of ours? Liza said to her mother, as if we did anything. I feel sorry for Papa, but why torment us? You can't help at all, so leave off. We can ease your suffering. Even that you can't do. Leave off. Again, if you're a medical practitioner, palliative care, recognition of your limitations, the limitations of your craft, very difficult when you're trying to help. Doctor came out to the drawing room and informed Praskovia that things were very bad and the only remedy was opium. And the more terrible than his physical sufferings were his moral sufferings. And these were his chief torment. That's what the doctor says. Okay, but this is now not the judgment of a doctor. This is the judgment of a spiritual doctor. Just like in Romeo and Juliet, there's a doctor that comes in. Or actually even in Hamlet, when Lady Macbeth goes mad, she says she doesn't need a doctor. She needs a priest, because there's something here that's tormenting her. It's not mental health only. There's more than that at this stage. And again, Gerasim comes in. Remember Gerasim, the Gerasim demoniac, the man crazy? At this point, his moral sufferings consisted in the fact that looking at Gerasim's sleepily good-natured, high cheekbone face that night, it suddenly occurred to him, and what if my whole life, my conscious life, has indeed not been right? Has been not right. But if that's so, he said to himself, and if I'm quitting this life with the consciousness that I have ruined everything that was given me, and it is impossible to rectify it, what then? I can only imagine. Many people must live this, like this, with this question. What then? Started going over his life in a totally new way. Why? Because he's asking real questions now. And so Tolstoy is doing something that the novelist can do that the dramatist can't do, and that's to get inside the minds of the characters and to walk us through it. And again, we are in the position of Ivan here, imagining ourselves on his deathbed, thinking through the thoughts that I have never entertained myself. But in them he saw himself. All that he lived by saw clearly that it was all not right, that it was all a terrible, vast deception, concealing both life and death. This consciousness increased his physical sufferings tenfold. The connection between mind and body. He's in more pain because there's a moral dissociation. He's very distressed by this. And he calls for communion. What? Take communion? Why? There's no need, although she began to cry. Yes, my dear, I'll send for ours. He's so nice. Excellent, very good, he said. When the priest came and confessed him, he softened, felt a sort of relief from his doubts and consequently from his sufferings. And a moment of hope came over him. He began thinking about the appendix again and the possibility of its mending. He took communion with tears in his eyes. Note that it gives him a sense of hope again, optimism. And when they laid him down after communion, he felt ease for a moment and the hopes of life appeared again. He began to think about the operation, suggested, to live, I want to live. His wife came to congratulate him on his communion. She said the usual words and added, isn't it true you're feeling better? He said yes, without looking at her. Sound of her voice all told him one thing, not right. All that you've lived and live by is a lie, a deception, concealing life and death from you. And as soon as he thought it, note that she doesn't say this, it's her look, which he infers from knowing his wife, why does he know what his wife is thinking? Because that's the way he used to think, and probably still does. So it's not actually, again, indicting his wife per se, but thinking about that mindset. As soon as he thought, his hatred arose, and together with hatred, his tormenting physical sufferings, and with his sufferings, the conscience of near inevitable destruction. The expression of his face when he said yes was terrible. And then he says again, go away, shouting, and leave me alone. And from that moment, a 3-day ceaseless howling. Oh, and then I won't. And all 3 days, thrashing about in that black sack into which an invisible, invincible force was pushing him. Note that he's not falling. The stone at first he was falling. Now he has the sense, now this is important, he has the sense of something or someone participating in the action of his death. Now this sense of being pushed it may seem no different than falling, but it is different. There's a sense of another being there. He's being pushed. And that's a comforting thought. Remember in the Everyman, God sends death. That's God's emissary. Same here. He's pushed into the black site in which an invisible, invincible force was pushing him. He struggled as one condemned to death, struggles in the executioner's hands, knowing he cannot save himself. And with every moment he felt that despite all his efforts to struggle, he was coming closer and closer to what terrified him. He felt that his torment lay in being thrust into that black hole, and still more in being unable to get into it. Oh, he can't get into it. There's a divergence even within him. He doesn't want to, and at the same time, he can't get into it. What kept him from getting into it was the claim that this had been a good life. Oh, how about that? He's still lying to himself. That's what prevents him from dying. It's actually keeping him. There's a mercy in this. He's not ready yet. This justification of his life clutched at him and would not let him move forward and tormented him most of all. Suddenly, some force shoved him in the chest, in the side, choked his breath. Still more, he fell through the hole, and there at the end of the hole, something lit up. What was done to him was like what happens on the train when you think you're moving forward, but are moving backward, and suddenly find out the real direction. Remember when Dante, the pilgrim, goes down through the inferno and pops up on purgatory on the other side, and he thinks he's going downwards and suddenly finds he's going upward? This was at the end of the third day, an hour before his death. Remember the 3 days of Jesus' crucifixion, resurrection? Same 3 days being symbolized here. And just when Ilych fell through, saw a light, and it was revealed to him that his life had not been what it ought, but that it could still be rectified, he asked himself what was right and grew still, listening. Here he felt that someone was kissing his hand. He opened up and looked at his son. He felt sorry for him. His wife came over to him. He looked at her. She was gazing at him with a despairing expression, open mouth, and with unwiped tears on her nose and cheek. He felt sorry for her. Yes, I'm tormenting them, he thought. So he's not thinking about himself for once. We're sorry. They're sorry, but it will be better for them when I die. He wanted to say that, but was unable to bring it out. Anyway, how? Why speak? I must act, he thought. He indicated to his son, to his wife with his eyes, and said, take him away. Sorry for you too. He also wanted to say forgive, but said forgo. And no longer able to correct himself, waved his hand, knowing that the one who had to would understand. The one who had to would understand. And suddenly, he became attentive. What's become of it? Where are you, pain? His pain. Remember his ever-present pain? Where are you? And there it was. Well then, let there be pain. And death, where is it? He sought his old habitual fear of death and could not find it. Where was it? What death? There was no more fear because there was no more death. Instead of death, there was light. So that's it, he said aloud. What joy! For him, all this happened in an instant, and the significance of that instant never changed. For those present, his agony went on for 2 more hours. Something gurgled in his chest. His emaciated body kept twitching. Then the gurgling and wheezing gradually subsided. It's finished. Tetelestai. Jesus breathed his last, says it's finished. It's finished. Someone said over him, he heard those words and repeated them in his soul. Death is finished, he said to himself. It is no more. Last enemy is death. Where is thy sting, O death? 1 Corinthians 15, 50 thereabouts, right? So it's a Christian, he uses Christian language to deal with the meaning of death that applies to himself, applies to his audience, and he's encouraging his audience to think of the meaning of death for the purposes of living. And he doesn't get to that because obviously Ivan has never lived a life in accordance with the theology of the cross, but we, the audience, can think so. So that's what I propose we do. I've run out of time. Anyone have a comment or question at the end? If not, I'll see you next time. Okay? Good. Thank you.